Chapter 1: The Meaning of Life. The lecture on anthropological research methods had left many questions unanswered for me. After the lecture, later that afternoon, I paid the teaching assistant a visit in order to clarify some points raised by the professor. When I entered the office, I found the teaching assistant at his desk eating pistachio nuts. He was deliberately aiming the shells out the window at unsuspecting students on the lawn below. I had once been sitting on the building steps, under that very window, when something had landed on the top of my head. I thought that pigeons were roosting in the rooftop crannies, but I discovered, upon closer inspection, that what had hit me was not pigeon droppings, but pistachio nut shells. Now I understood where those shells were coming from. This one is a real poor baby, I thought, watching Rex Jones turn red at being caught at his tricks. He had a sheepish grin and a boyish demeanor and the overall sense which Clara Mendez referred to as the poor baby syndrome. She pointed out that all of us were operating under the social and psychological command that we had to regard ourselves and present ourselves at all times, if possible, in the light of poor baby, me. At the time she told me this, I resented it immensely and argued the point, but after a soulful examination, I had to admit that I myself loved to be regarded as a poor baby. Not only this, but I had not come across anyone who did not fall into that category. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," I said to Rex Jones, "but today's lecture brought up some points I would like to discuss with you. That is, if you're not too busy." With a thrust of his leg, Rex Jones pushed his swivel chair away from the window. "How can I help you?" he said, pointing to a chair. I noticed he took in an eyeful of the rising hemline of my skirt as I sat down. "I don't understand how anthropologists can know what is going on in a foreign culture when they don't even speak the language," I said, pulling my skirt down over my knees. Rex Jones smiled nervously, but the nervous twitch of his pale cheek betrayed impatience. "Anthropologists practice a method called participant observation," he said, hammering on his words. He glanced at his watch to gauge how much time he had before his office hour was over. "The anthropologist fieldworker participates in the activities of the society he's studying. He takes copious notes, he tape records and photographs everything pertinent, which, upon returning from the field, he analyzes within the framework of his theory. In other words, he uses his data to prove the hypothesis he is set out to test." "Are you saying that the anthropologist already knows what kind of data he wants to isolate before he goes to the field?" I asked. "Isn't that being biased?" Rex Jones gave his chair a little swivel toward the desk and put on his wire-rimmed glasses, carefully adjusting them over each ear. "That isn't bias, it's his modus operandi. If anthropology is to be a science," he continued, leaning towards me, "it must follow the scientific method, which is hypothesis testing. His findings must be open to verification." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning that another fieldworker collecting the same data under similar circumstances would obtain the same results." "But what about Lewis and Redfield in Tepoztlan?" I asked. I was referring to the classic case in which two fieldworkers doing research in the same rural community in Mexico had obtained dramatically different results, thereby showing that replication, although theoretically advisable, might not be feasible in actual practice. "That was a special case," Rex Jones conceded. "It only proves that the researchers weren't looking at the same things, or documenting their work carefully enough, and that's precisely my point. Social science entails careful documentation." I reminded him how difficult it was for two people in our own culture to agree about a given issue, even though the issue was familiar to both of them, a condition which made agreement about issues of a foreign culture nearly miraculous. "Anthropologists are people before they are scientists?" I pointed out. "So, while they are participating and observing, wouldn't they also be emotionally involved in a life where everything is strange? Wouldn't they have feelings, opinions, and interpret events according to their past experiences?" Images of the cave in northern Mexico, where I had spent many months reliving my own past experiences in a process called the recapitulation, came to mind. I remembered how difficult it had been for Clara Mendez, my teacher, and I to reach an agreement about anything, including what she had meant by the poor baby syndrome. She was departing from the inconceivable viewpoint of what she referred to as the sorcery tradition, and I saw everything from the predictable vantage point of my middle-class upbringing. We had heated arguments in her kitchen, disagreements in which we were talking at cross purposes, not seeing the world in the same terms at all. Rex Jones chuckled condescendingly at my moment of introspection, which he seemed to interpret as confusion. "You're missing the point," he said, shaking his head. "That's precisely why anthropologists need to follow a strict methodology decided upon beforehand. Fieldworkers must refrain from making subjective interpretations and stick to recording objective facts. Look at the sociologists downstairs." He was referring to the Department of Demographers, who had their offices on the second floor. At one point in the history of the university, anthropology had been a part of the sociology department, but now they prided themselves in being independent, but not too independent, it seemed, when it came to methodology. It was partially the fear of becoming a hardened actuary that had made me select anthropology as a major. It still had an air of romanticism to it, a certain sense of adventure surviving from the 19th century travelers' accounts in which modern-day anthropology has its roots. Despite the fieldworkers' efforts to categorize everything via the scientific method, anthropology still had the potential for exploring the unknown, of crossing conceptual boundaries. "What about the sociologists?" I asked, clicking my pen to the open position in case I had to take notes. Sociology, as we know, depends on how reliable its data collection techniques are and on the ability to verify its findings. That's why they use statistical analysis, surveys, in-depth interviews, to ensure replication. Anthropology must copy their methodology because verification is even more important in our discipline, where, as you yourself have pointed out, everything is strange. I noticed Rex's roving eye dart at my legs again. I gave him a fierce look that Clara Mendez, the champion of women, would have been proud of. I had always assumed the vulnerable state of women was a natural condition resulting from our biological makeup, but Clara had set the record straight from the outset. "Biology my foot," she had said. "Licking men's balls and being their servants is not the result of any biology, but of the mesmeric commands of our male-dominated culture." I was shocked to hear her say that at the time, and it was only after months of listening to Clara's sermons about the plight of women, and immersing myself in the practice called the recapitulation, that I began to see more clearly the pitiful position society has allocated for the female species. It was obvious that we women had to fight twice as hard as men to succeed in anything we did. Once in our own right, and once again to overcome the powerful predispositions thrust upon us by our male culture. One of the reasons for attending the university and cultivating the intellect, I was told, was to be able to grasp and evaluate for myself the taken-for-granted views of the role of women, and in so doing, free myself from their mesmeric grip. "A stranger coming to study culture, which is an abstraction," I said, picking up the thread of our argument, "could work in the field for years without ever realizing that he is misunderstanding what he sees or what the people are doing. It has happened to countless researchers and to Peace Corps workers." "The anthropologists and Peace Corps workers I know are pretty astute," Rex said. "They know when someone is bullshitting them." "What if the anthropologist wants to help the people he is living with?" I proposed. "What if he or she gets so involved in the culture that it is impossible for him or her to remain objective?" I was thinking of events that had happened under the tutelage of Clara and her colleagues, and of how I would never be able to explain their worldview adequately using the theories of anthropology or the scientific method. "Then he or she is no longer an anthropologist," said Rex, raising a bushy eyebrow. "He or she is simply a social worker or a do-gooder, or worse yet, has gone native." To bring his point home, he cited several cases in which the anthropologist had gone native. The first incident involved a researcher working among the Navajo Indians. While studying the peyote cult, using the method of participant observation, he ingested far too many peyote buttons to remain objective. He had visions of the Great Spirit, received countless messages, and when he came out of his hallucinogenic state, he started his own religion. And don't forget the case of Beth Wasserman, a field worker in Samoa, Rex reminded me, reaching for his pipe. Was she one of Boas's students, like Margaret Mead? He shook his head. I had the distinct feeling that he was pulling my leg. What about Beth Wasserman? I ventured. She went to Samoa to collect data for her doctoral dissertation on sexual customs and marriage rights. She put aside her objectivity and participated far too much more than was necessary, if you catch my drift. Rex made a lewd gesture that left no doubt as to the nature of Ruth Wasserman's participation among the Samoans. What happened to her? I asked, certain that the story would not end well. She fell in love with a Polynesian prince, Rex said, shaking the stem of his pipe at me as if he were scolding a child. She broke the taboos and the witch doctor put a curse on her. She nearly died in childbirth, if the minister hadn't intervened with his white magic. Beth left the islands in disgrace and never finished her research. Silence fell upon the room. Rex looked at me to assess my reaction. I'm still not convinced, I said doggedly. It seems to me that the whole approach to anthropology is wrong. You have to do more than merely observe to understand anything. You have to become involved. Rex took his pipe out of his mouth, turned it over and tapped it on the edge of an ashtray. Nothing fell out. I realized he was using the pipe as a placebo to help him stop smoking, or perhaps to make him appear more distinguished. You don't have to taste an apple to know that it's red, he reminded me. But how do you know what an apple tastes like unless you bite into it? I countered. If you go to the field already burdened with a bag of hypotheses, you're not really being open to the experiences, which is the whole point of anthropology, the study of man, what he believes in, how he feels, how he thinks, how he relates to the universe. Rex smacked his lips and stuck the pipe back into his mouth. He seemed to have come to the end of his patience. You're asking questions that belong to the domain of philosophy. If you want to know about the meaning of life, you're in the wrong department. Although my friend Carlos might be able to answer some of your questions. He's an apprentice to a Mexican shaman. Upon hearing his name, the teaching assistant sitting at an adjacent desk put down the book he was reading and turned to face Rex. She wants to know about the meaning of life, Rex said. I'll be damned if I can answer her questions, so I'll leave her in your hands. He glanced at his watch again. Besides, I'm late. I have to drive all the way to Gardenia. Rex stuffed some examination papers into his briefcase and hurriedly left the room. What's so pressing in Gardenia? I asked, turning my chair to face Carlos. Rex likes to gamble, Carlos said in a hushed tone. And Gardenia is the only place near here where it's legal. Mark my words, one of these days he'll gamble away his research grant to Nepal. Carlos had black curly hair, a smiling friendly face, and a mischievous sparkle in his dark shiny eyes. I had the unsettling feeling that I had seen him before, not just in the anthropology department, but somewhere else, and that we were united by an invisible bond, but try as I might, I could not remember where or when we had met. Carlos leaned forward and looked at me intently as if he, too, had experienced a kind of déjà vu. Haven't we met before? He said, obviously aware of the cliché. Even though he had taken the words right out of my mouth, it sounded so much like the classic line that I became defensive. You've probably seen me around the halls, I said, trying to sound casual. Or in Hitchcock's class. Perhaps, he said, giving me a pensive look. His gaze actually held me the way hypnotists might grasp a patient. You're much too young and pretty to worry about the meaning of life, he said in a friendly tone. You can't be more than 19 or 20. Why not leave the weighty questions to the wizened philosophers? I'm 22 and I'm very much interested in the meaning of life, I snapped, annoyed by what seemed to me a chauvinistic statement. What's the point to all this? There must be something more that makes life worth living than the bullshit we've gotten every day of our lives. As I spoke, I gesticulated with my hands, knocking over a dish of paper clips on his desk. They scattered over his papers, but Carlos pretended not to notice. "I respect your concerns," he said, leaning toward me. "It's just that most people really aren't interested in the meaning of anything except, perhaps, of love." "I disagree," I said. "What about the seekers and meditators? They're always searching for answers to life's fundamental questions." "True, but in my opinion, the so-called gurus are not so much engaged in a bona fide philosophical inquiry, but in an attempt to intensify their experiences. They are looking for the meaning of life precisely because they are bored with life. If they would live life with gusto, they would not be so concerned with searching for its meaning." I had a feeling he was including me in the category of those who lacked gusto in their lives. "Come back in 20 years after you've lived and then we can talk about the meaning of life," he said with a wink. "In 20 years the entire world might be blown to bits." I snapped. "Is that the intensity of experience you're talking about?" I realized from his pained expression that I was shouting. I don't know why I had gotten so riled up. A cool gust of wind came in from the open window and ruffled the examination papers on Carlos's desk. I took a deep breath to calm myself. "If you really want to know about the meaning of life," Carlos said, "you should meet this Yaqui Indian I'm working with. He knows a great deal about life and its meaning. In fact, he is one of the wisest people I've ever met. Perhaps we can go to Mexico sometime and I'll introduce you to him." Upon hearing this, I experienced an intense apprehension. I began to perspire. All my senses were on red alert. Perhaps Carlos was just making polite conversation, or maybe he was trying to proposition me with some sort of a trip. At any rate, I felt a deep uneasiness. Going to Mexico with Clara Mendez was one thing, but to go with a strange man was another. The worst part was that something inside me wanted to return to Mexico in the worst way. I looked at Carlos, trying to discern his meaning, when for an instant, I thought he had shrunk and moved backwards in space. It was as if I were seeing him from the end of a long tunnel. I continued staring dumbfounded, and suddenly I recalled where I had seen him before. Once I had had a vision of a gathering of sorcerers in Mexico. One of them was a young Latin man with dark curly hair that looked very much like the person talking to me now. The more I looked at Carlos, the more this secret suspicion grew inside me. With no rational foundation, I became convinced that Carlos was the young man of my vision, the new Nawal. I remembered being told that when power put us in contact, he would bring me to Mexico where I would meet the other members of the present Nawal's party that were waiting for me. I tried recalling who these other members were, but I was certain that except for Clara, Nalita, and a strange bird-like creature named Emilito, I had never met them. I was shocked to realize that my time in Los Angeles had almost obliterated their memory. My overwhelming concern with daily activities and my studies at the university had created a wall of forgetfulness. The dull oblivion that surrounded me was so dense that the time I had spent in Mexico became vague and dreamlike, as if it had never happened. Yet, of one thing, I was certain: I had been expressly commanded not to return to Mexico or search for anyone until power again opened the way, and when that moment came, I had to seize the quarter centimeter of chance power offered, or the door would close, perhaps never to open again. As a wave of memory swept over me, I felt my ears buzzing and experienced a profound dizziness. I wanted to run away, yet I heard myself saying, "I'd like to go to Mexico," in a voice that could hardly be my own, for it came from the distant end of that long tunnel. I looked up and realized that Carlos was also confused. It was obvious from his expression that he had not expected me to take his invitation seriously, let alone give him a definitive answer. "Are you all right?" Carlos asked with genuine concern. "I'm perfectly fine," I said, shaking my head to clear it. "It's just so warm in here." As I regained my senses, I told myself that I had gotten only a glimpse of a face, and that the vision of the Nawal's party had been so fleeting I could have easily been mistaken about this young man. Most likely he wasn't the same person at all. Yet in spite of my rational doubts, I was driven by an unknown force. I had the certainty that if Carlos was the man in my vision, I could only find that out in Mexico, and if I didn't act now, I would never get another chance. I do want to go to Mexico, I repeated. Well, that would be great, Carlos said uneasily, gathering up the paper clips I had spilled. We'll do that sometime. I really want to go. When would be a good time? I go to Sonora every other weekend, Carlos said hesitantly. All right. How about next weekend? I'll be through with my exams by then. Whoa, not so fast, Carlos said, trying to back off. Don't you think we should go to a movie or have dinner or something first, instead of rushing off to Mexico? After all, we hardly know each other. Movies bore me, and I never eat in restaurants, I said. Besides, I'd like to meet this sorcerer informant that you are working with. I promise I wouldn't be in the way. I could tell Carlos was peeved by my insistence, but that his curiosity was also piqued. He seemed to be considering the possibilities, but then had a sudden change of heart. Really, I don't think I could just spring someone on the old man, he said. Especially a young woman. Do you speak Spanish? Yes, I do, I lied without flinching. He looked surprised. It still isn't a good idea. I don't know why I brought it up in the first place. Let's forget the whole thing. It is a good idea, I said enthusiastically. Think of it as an appointment with destiny. Again, Carlos hesitated. How about asking your informant if it's all right to bring a friend from the university, I suggested. A fellow anthropology student. What harm is there in that? If he says, no, we'll forget about it. It can't hurt to ask. What do you have to lose? Carlos sighed with relief, as if he had found a way out. He was certain that his Yaqui Indian informant would not wish to meet a young woman from the United States. All right, I'll ask if I can bring someone, he conceded. If he agrees, I'll call you and you can join me in Nogales. I wrote my phone number on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. I watched him slip it into his shirt pocket. As I left the room, I was certain he would never mention me to his Indian informant, let alone use the phone number. The following week, late at night, I received an unexpected phone call.